Hi. Hi, Katie. I guess this is the part where I introduce myself. Well, my name is Rachel Zilberg, and I live in the South Bay in Northern California. I'm 24 years old, and I was class of Stanford 2018. I currently work as a video game writer, but on my own time, I've been doing a lot of writing and performing for immersive theater, which I imagine is what we're going to talk about today.
That is what we're going to talk about. And I think the first time I ever vaguely interacted with you, you were still a redhead and you were doing the Vagina Monologues at Stanford, and I was like, oh my goodness, who is this person and how do I get to know them better?
So the thing about the Vagina Monologues, though, is that it was the first full-length thing in many ways that I had ever directed, and if I were to do it again now, I would have done so many things differently. And of course, hindsight is 2020, but I'm proud of little freshman me for directing.
I was completely blown away, and I think every project, when we grow and learn about things, we'd always want to do it a different way. But
yeah, I think one of the best phrases I ever heard on that was something like, "Your vision for your work will always be about 5 years ahead of where you are," and that seemed correct.
I love that. Yeah, I love the concept of there being a gap between the work that you admire and the work that you're creating, and then you're working to close that gap and just get better every year. So, but with that in mind, you should explain what immersive theater is and what you're working on.
I can do that. So, immersive theater, to define it briefly, because I'm sure I could go on for far more than 10 minutes about this. Essentially, it's a form of theater wherein the actors intentionally break the fourth wall in order to interact with the audience. Really, what you need for a piece of immersive theater to take place is you need a story, and you need at least one actor, and you need at least one participant / audience member who is willing to take part in that story that the actor is offering to them. And part of what I find to be so revolutionary about this medium is that it breaks down a lot of the rules and expectations of traditional proscenium theater, because you don't even really need a proscenium. You could have a show that, like I said, literally has one audience member and one actor, and it's a very intimate thing, but technically within those parameters, that is still theater. And I think that when people think about theater, they often are not questioning what are the bare bones of what something needs to be in order to be considered a theatrical production. And immersive, I find, really draws in those questions in a really interesting way.
Yeah, and I've seen a lot of experimental work, especially at Stanford, that you don't have scenery, or you don't have, or it's only music, or you have a presentation behind, or statistics that are being screamed out by the audience, or just things that completely change your perception of this traditional medium to be modern or postmodern. And I think that's wonderful, especially now during the age of COVID. The fact that you can still have immersive theater digitally is something that's really amazing to me.
I mean, that really has saved me during this pandemic in many ways. And I also do want to say that a lot of the work that went on at Stanford was immensely inspiring to me. And I still remember some of the devised shows that people did. And I think that those still stick with me in the things that I make today. But yeah, I think that when the pandemic hit, a lot of the immersive community, especially, there was a time right before the pandemic where a bunch of immersive stuff was happening down in Los Angeles, and I would be jetting over there almost every weekend to go do shows. And I was sort of doing a self-directed independent study to learn everything I could about this medium. So I would go to shows and try to kind of deconstruct them in my mind and take little notes and make a lot of friends. And so when the pandemic hit, nobody really knew what to do. And they were like, we can't perform. What do we do? But suddenly there was this sort of renaissance that occurred where not only did the medium become a lot more geographically open to people all over the country, and in some ways all over the world, who wanted to share in this art form, but it put the pros and the beginners on a strangely level playing field in terms of the craft itself, because nobody knew how to write a show for Zoom. They all had to figure it out at the same time. And so then a lot of really interesting stuff cropped up.
That's incredible, and I want to hear about that. What is something that surprised you or inspired you or excited you by this transition to Zoom that you had not expected?
Well, I think Zoom also is not the best way to describe all that people do, because quite frankly, some of the shows that I've seen that people have done on Zoom haven't been that impressive to me, and some of the more experimental mediums have been particularly cool. People have been going back to analog telephone conversations where they have characters call you up and have an hour and a half long conversation with you, and that's the show. That stuff has been incredible. So I'll be like on my walks during the pandemic in the middle, because I've been taking these walks in the middle of the night. It's like not great to do as a woman, but also I have simple pleasures now. And I would just be walking along in the dark in the empty town and have a character on the other line of my phone, which was a really cool mode of connection during this really bizarre time. And I've been doing a lot of work in particular with this fantastic little theater project called the Black Art Collective. We do immersive horror specifically, where we try to scare you and also break your heart. We do lots of things. And we do our show primarily over the Discord messaging platform, which, if you're unfamiliar, is mostly used by gamers. And it's, if you got text and you got little channels and you got audio. And so we would have a lot of essentially role play where our characters would be through text interacting with our participants, and they'd be able to explore our world through text. And we also had a lot of poetry as part of these shows. And so using that medium of text in a way that you can't necessarily in live theater allowed us to bring poetry into our production in a more like immediate way, which was for people reference and look at, which was very cool. So there are lots of like new things popping up.
That's like an amazing connection to writing for video games too, because that's such a like, I've always thought about like when I play video games as a kid or like text-based anything, like it's such a shame that those things aren't things that we experience in the daily world. And in some ways that like form of escapism is so beautiful and wonderful to have. And so now when you can combine that with actors and real people who are talking to you or whatever, I think that's so exciting. That's something that's like truly like medium bridging, and I think that's so cool.
Yeah, and the agency of it is something that honestly inspires me the most, because when you play a video game, sometimes you can have immense levels of agency. Like you look at a game like Detroit Become Human and you ignore the parts that are problematic, like the robot Civil War. And then you see though that there's an impressive amount of branching and a lot of different things that can happen based on like the minute things that you do. But in immersive, an actor can be improvising on the spot and having to adapt like that based on something an audience member decides to say or do in that moment. So it's this art form that is consistently alive and is consistently changing based on what the audience is throwing at it.
So in some ways it's even closer to improv than it is to traditional theater.
Yeah, a lot of improv skills for sure. It's a really interesting mix because you often do have rails that you're on and a place where the show needs to go, and there often are bits that are more tightly scripted, but there's also a lot of room for play, both for the actors and for the audience.
That's amazing. So how did you do this in the first place? What got you into this?
Well, a long time ago, i.e. 2 years ago, I was reading all about, I did a deep dive, that's the phrase. I was reading about this augmented reality game, ARG for short, by this really amazing man named Darren Lynn Bousman, called The Tension Experience, where what I knew about it was there were all these people in Los Angeles who would get these phone calls from fictional characters who would tell them, like in the middle of their lives, I need you to go pick up this box on XY Avenue, and they would just do it. And so this whole fictional universe, this like bizarre conspiracy with these cults and weird organizations would be like directly layered on top of people's everyday lives when they were participants in this thing that lasted for like a year. And I just thought that was the most amazing mode of storytelling I'd ever heard of, and I knew that I had to know more. So unfortunately, Tension ended before I was old enough to take part in it and to travel around, but I wound up doing another show that Darren put on in this big warehouse in Los Angeles that was called the Theater Macabre. I was just transfixed and hypnotized. And then I just kind of fell down the rabbit hole from there.
Amazing. Well, that's about all that we have time for, so we'll leave the story off there to be continued into the future. But
sounds good. Thank you, Katie. This was
all
lovely.
Of this. This is like the world's most cool version of Pokemon Go for humans, and
it's pretty rad, and I hope to keep making it. I'm excited to put on the show I'm working on for the spring. Fingers crossed that it'll go as well as I want it to.
I'm positive it will, so thank you.
And you should get a ticket when they go on sale. I'll give you one for free because you're my friend.
Thank you.